Young and the Restless spoilers. Nikki Newman's misery didn't arrive in a single moment. It accumulated like pressure behind glass. Each day of Victor's AI war against Jabo adding another invisible fracture, until the entire structure of her marriage felt one breath away from shattering. She had endured Victor's ruthlessness before, his need to win, his refusal to forgive, his instinct to control every variable in the lives of the people he claimed to love, but this time it felt different, colder, almost inhuman. Because the cruelty was no longer confined to private arguments or business maneuvering that stayed safely behind closed doors. The AI program became a weapon that moved with the precision of a machine and the malice of a man who believed he was entitled to punish an entire family. And Nikki could feel how it poisoned the air around her. It wasn't merely that Victor wanted to destroy Jack Abbott. It was that he wanted to prove that Jack's world could be dismantled with a few strategic keystrokes. That the Abbott legacy could be reduced to numbers collapsing on a screen. That any protection Jack offered Nikki in her darkest years could be erased as if it never mattered. Nikki's anger wasn't a flare-up, it was a steady burn confin. Relentless because she recognized the pattern. Victor justified everything as protection, as loyalty, as righteous retribution. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He was punishing Jack for being present in Nikki's life in a way Victor could not control, and he was willing to torch Abbott's future to make sure Jack learned his place. That realization didn't just wound Nikki. It humiliated her because it implied she was still a territory to be defended rather than a human being with agency. She tried to hold herself together through discipline, through pride, through the hard-earned instincts of sobriety that had taught her how to survive a craving, a panic attack, a long night when the mind whispers that one drink could make the world quiet. But sobriety is not only the absence of alcohol. It is the presence of truth. And Nikki's truth was that Victor's behavior had become an emotional trigger she could not outrun. The moment he shouted in her face and practically dared her to leave, something shifted inside her, something old and dangerous, sense that the man she loved would rather be feared than be kind. That he would rather be right than be safe, and that he would rather win a war than keep her whole. In the silence that followed, Nikki's thoughts returned to the one thing she had tried not to touch, not to remember too clearly, because it felt like touching a live wire, the secret USB, the evidence. The buried proof of a murder Victor had helped keep hidden, a truth so poisonous that simply carrying it had once made Nikki feel like she was walking around with blood on her hands. She remembered the day she gave it to Jack Abbott just in case, not out of loyalty to Jack, but out of a desperate need to build an emergency exit for herself. A final safeguard against the possibility that Victor's darkness would someday swallow her. At the time, she had told herself it was only a contingency, a precaution, a way to stop herself from becoming fully complicit. Now, with the AI war escalating and Victor's cruelty hardening into something that left no room for tenderness, Nikki understood that the contingency had arrived. And in that understanding, something in her hardened to not into Victor's coldness, but into a clarity that felt like a last chance. She could continue begging a powerful man to be gentle, or she could end the cycle by bringing the truth into the light, no matter how ugly it was, no matter who it burned. Nikki didn't make the decision lightly. She made it the way people make decisions when they are cornered, when staying silent feels like drowning and speaking feels like jumping into fire. She told herself that confession was not revenge, that exposing Victor was not betrayal, that ending the secret was the only way to stop it from continuing to shape every choice she made. If Victor's war was being fought with AI, then Nikki's counterattack would be fought with something Victor could never fully predict or program, the truth he thought he had buried. She contacted Jack in secret, not because she wanted comfort or rescue, but because she needed an ally who understood the weight of what she was asking and the consequences that would follow. The request was urgent, almost brutal in its necessity. Meet her. Now somewhere no one would notice, somewhere their proximity could not be twisted into scandal before the plan even began. Jack was stunned not by Nikki's willingness to reach out, because the bond between them had always existed in that complicated space between friendship, history, and mutual survival, but by the specific darkness implied in her urgency. He understood immediately that this wasn't about another argument with Victor or another emotional plea. This was about leverage so explosive that it could reshape Genoa City's power map overnight. Jack had spent enough years living under Victor Newman's shadow to know that evidence against Victor was never simple. It never stayed contained. It came with a price that spread outward like shrapnel, cutting allies and enemies alike. When Jack agreed to meet, he did so with the grim focus of a man who has long understood that sometimes the only way to stop a predator is to publicly that the predator bleeds. Their meeting place was chosen with care, a location that held no sentimental meaning, no familiar pattern, nothing that could be easily traced by routine or surveillance. Nikki arrived with the kind of stillness that looks like strength until you realize it is the stillness of someone holding themselves together by sheer force. She didn't need to dramatize the moment. The urgency lived in her eyes, in the way she seemed to carry both rage and grief in the same breath. She explained why no we not later. Why not after another attempt at reconciliation? Why not after Victor calmed down? Because Victor never truly calmed down, he only redirected his fury. And the AI were proved that he was escalating, not learning. Because every day Nikki stayed silent, she felt more like an accomplice. Because the guilt she had tried to bury was beginning to rot her from the inside. And rot is how relapse begins it with a drink. But with a sense of moral contamination so overwhelming that the mind starts searching for escape. Nikki didn't frame it as a noble crusade. She framed it as a confession that had become non-negotiable. The USB was no longer an insurance policy. It was a verdict waiting to be delivered. Jack listened, conflicted, because Jack Abbott had his own history of mistakes that made him wary of playing hero, wary of becoming the man who pushes Nikki into another storm, wary of turning her pain into a strategy against Victor. He hesitated not because he doubted Victor's capacity for evil, but because he understood Nikki's fragility beneath her determination, the way trauma can masquerade as courage, the way a person can decide to burn everything down because they no longer trust that anything can be saved. But he also recognized the other truth. Victor's AI attack on Jabba wasn't just business. It was a vendetta aimed at erasing Jack's life's work, and it was being carried out with a ruthlessness that would not stop until someone forced it to stop. Nikki's evidence represented a rare thing in Genoa City, an actual chain capable of restraining a man who believed himself untouchable. Jack's reluctance didn't vanish, but it shifted into something sharper: responsibility. If Nikki was offering him the weapon that could end Victor's war, then refusing to use it meant accepting whatever destruction came next. He didn't agree as a triumphant move. He agreed with the heavy awareness that once this door opened, it would never close again. Together, they began to plan, not like conspirators intoxicated by power, but like two people handling a live bomb. The release of the evidence had to be timed, controlled, and framed in a way that prevented Victor from twisting the narrative into another feud story where he could paint himself as the victim of Abbott manipulation. It had to be undeniable. It had to land so cleanly that even Victor's resourceless lawyers, his influence, his ability to intimidate tech couldn't easily bury it again. Nikki insisted on one condition in her own mind. This could not be done as a petty strike meant to elevate Jack. It had to be done as a moral rupture, the moment where the secrets Victor hoarded finally cost him something real. Jack, understanding the stakes, began preparing for the inevitable retaliation, not just corporate counterpunches, but personal devastation. Victor would not simply lose gracefully, he would attack the way he always did, identifying the most vulnerable points and pressing until something breaks. And Nikki, as always, would be the center of the blast. Yet she stayed committed, because commitment was the only alternative to surrender. She had spent years telling herself that love meant enduring Victor's storms, but now she began to redefine love as the refusal to enable. If Victor chose cruelty, Nikki would no longer soften its consequences. Victor felt the shift before he had proof, because Victor Newman could read silence the way other people read headlines. Nikki's posture changed in subtle ways, less pleading, fewer attempts to coax him back from the edge, a calm that didn't look like forgiveness but like preparation. Jack's movements changed to not in obvious public gestures, but in a cautious tightening of his orbit, as if he were bracing for impact. Victor's instincts, honed by decades of war, did not ignore patterns like that. He began to suspect that Nikki and Jack were sharing something he wasn't controlling, and suspicion, for Victor, was not a feeling, it was a command. He started watching for the smallest cracks, a missed call, a vague explanation, a delay in Nikki's response that suggested she was thinking rather than reacting. He told himself it was impossible for Nikki to truly betray him, because Victor often mistook loyalty for ownership. But another part of Mulder. Cole remembered that Nikki had once survived without him, that she had fought addictions and trauma and still stood, and that a woman who can rebuild herself can also walk away. The AI program, which had once felt like his perfect advantage, now became a liability in his mind, because it suggested he had created too many enemies too quickly. Victor didn't know about the USB, not explicitly, but he felt the shape of danger approaching, and that was enough to make him ruthless in ways Nikki had dreaded. He began to test boundaries, to push Nikki emotionally and then watch her reaction, as if he could provoke a mistake that would reveal her plan. Nikki, aware of this scrutiny, moved with careful precision, forcing herself to remain steady, forcing herself not to let fear turn into panic. Forcing herself to remember that the greatest risk in exposing Victor wasn't Victor's, rather it was her own temptation to escape the stress in the old way. She didn't drink. She didn't allow herself that weakness. But she felt the craving as an echo, a phantom limb, not because she wanted alcohol, but because she wanted relief, and relief was suddenly very far away. Jack's cooperation became both a stabilizing force and a new source of pressure. Because now Nikki wasn't only carrying her own truth. She was carrying the knowledge that she might be about to ignite a fire that consumes all of them. Still, she kept moving forward, because every time she hesitated, she saw Victor's face in that moment of cruelty, the moment he yelled, the moment he dismissed her ultimatum like it was a tantrum. That memory became her fuel. She told herself that if she didn't end this now, she would spend the rest of her life negotiating with a man who believed love meant obedience. By the time Victor's suspicions hardened into certainty that something was coming, Nikki and Jack had already crossed the point of return. They had prepared the path to release the evidence, to force a confrontation so massive that it would dwarf the AI war and expose Victor's hidden sins in a way that could not be explained away as business rivalry. Nikki understood that once the truth surfaced, she would lose the last illusion of safety she'd maintain at the illusion that Victor's love would always ultimately protect her. Truth doesn't protect, it transforms, and transformation is violent. Yet Nikki also understood that the violence had already been happening, only quietly, inside her marriage, inside her sobriety. Now it would finally have a direction. Victor, sensing the news tightening, began to move like a man who hears footsteps behind him in a dark hallway, angrier, faster, more prone to strike first. Nikki watched him with a steadiness that frightened even herself, because she realized she was no longer begging Victor to be better. She was preparing to prove what he truly was. And as the moment of exposure drew closer, one final terror rose in Nikki's throat like a warning she couldn't swallow. If Victor discovered what she and Jack were about to do before they could act, he wouldn't just retaliate against Jabo or Jackie would retaliate against the one thing Nikki valued more than any marriage or any empire. The one thing that would be easiest to weaponize against her, her fragile, hard-won stability. The plan was set, the evidence was ready. And Victor was circling like a predator who finally smells blood. So when Nikki's phone vibrated late at night with a message that clearly proved Victor had started connecting the dots, she realized the next 24 hours wouldn't decide a corporate war or a marriage. They would decide whether she could expose Victor before Victor broke her first. Victor Newman's arrest did not feel like a headline so much as a tectonic shift that cracked Genoa City's foundation and sent shockwaves through every room where his name had ever functioned like a threat. The evidence was no longer rumor, no longer a chess move that could be delayed with money or intimidation or a phone call to the right person. It was clean, undeniable, and arranged in a way that left no oxygen for denials. Victor had built his life on the belief that truth was negotiable if you owned enough power. But this time the truth arrived like a sealed door slamming shut. The kind of proof that doesn't ask for permission, the kind that converts confidence into handcuffs. Rage flooded him anyway, because rage was his reflex when control slipped. He did not collapse into regret, he calcified into fury. He told himself he had been too trusting, too careless, too certain that Nikki would never cross the line that separated marriage from war. That certainty became the cruelest joke of all, because Nikki was no longer the person pleading for peace or begging him to stop. She had become the person who stopped him. In Victor's mind, the betrayal wasn't merely that she helped expose him, it was that she dared to transform his private empire of secrets into public fact. The humiliation burned deeper than the threat of prison because humiliation was the one currency Victor never tolerated. And yet, beneath the rage, something colder began to form: calculation. Because Victor, even in chains, remained Victor. If Nikki was now his enemy, then she was also vulnerable, because Nikki had not lived a life untouched by shadows. She had loved Victor through storms, and love, especially love that survives too long, always leaves fingerprints on the worst decisions. Nikki had held secrets for him, carried them, buried them, rationalized them, and in doing so she had built her own trap without realizing it. Victor understood that better than anyone. He had always known that a person who holds evidence can become evidence. A person who knows where bodies are buried can be accused of digging the grave. A person who chooses the moment of exposure can be questioned for why they waited. The more the walls closed in around Victor, the more he fixated not on defending himself because that battle was already collapsing, but on whether he could drag Nikki into the wreckage with him. Not out of justice, not out of moral clarity, but out of a savage need to prove that if he was going down, he would not go alone. He began to view Nikki's triumph as temporary, a fragile window before the boomerang came back. He remembered every time Nikki had lied to protect him, every time she had stayed quiet when speaking would have been safer, every moment she had chosen loyalty over truth. Those memories were weapons now. And the true nightmare for Nikki was that Victor's weapons did not require new fabrication, they required only selective exposure. A single secret from Nikki's past, placed in the right hands at the right time, could become a second arrest, a second scandal, a second collapse that made the public wonder whether this was not a villain being taken down, but a couple imploding together under the weight of everything they had hidden for each other. Nikki felt that threat before Victor ever articulated it, because in the hours after the arrest, the victory she thought she would feel never arrived. Relief did not bloom, it tightened. She had imagined that exposing Victor would end her guilt, end her fear, end the war that had driven her to the edge of relapse. But instead it opened a new kind of tyranny built not on what Victor could do to Jabot, but on what Victor could do to her. Nikki knew with brutal clarity that she had not been innocent in the era when secrets were exchanged like currency. Even if she had not committed the same crimes Victor had, she had lived close enough to them to be stained. She had made choices to survive, choices to keep the family intact, choices that felt justified at the time and felt grotesque now under the harsh light of consequences. She had believed she could control the fallout by controlling the timing, by keeping the evidence contained until it had maximum impact. But timing cuts both ways. If Victor's crimes were now undeniable, Nikki's delayed confession could be painted as complicity, especially by a man who made other people's weaknesses his oxygen. And there was Jack Abbott as well in a lie, a partner in the exposure, but also another vulnerability, because Victor could twist Jack's involvement into a narrative of conspiracy, seduction, manipulation, anything that diluted Nikki's moral authority and made the public perception blur into everyone is dirty. Nikki could already feel that smear forming. Like smoke creeping under a door, Victor would tell the world that Nikki didn't reveal the truth out of conscience. He would claim she did it to punish him, to protect Jack, to rewrite her own history by framing herself as savior rather than accomplice. And the scariest part was that it might work, not because it was true, but because it was believable enough to plant doubt. In Genoa City, doubt is often all it takes to ruin someone. NIKKI had fought too hard for sobriety, for dignity, for the right to define herself as more than her worst chapters. And now she was facing the possibility that Victor could shred that identity with a single revelation. He did not have to prove she was evil. He only had to prove she was not clean. That would be enough to break the narrative she was trying to build, NIKKI as the woman who finally stood up to Victor's darkness. Because if NIKKI felt to if she was arrested tooth and Victor would be able to say, with that cold satisfaction he reserved for moments of destruction, that she was never above him. She was simply beside him, made of the same shadows, pretending otherwise until it became inconvenient. And that is the nightmare scenario that begins to take shape. What if Victor, cornered and furious, decides to reveal NIKKI's secret as retaliation, not caring how it destroys her? Because he believes she has already destroyed him? What if NIKKI, in the aftermath of her own moral gamble, becomes vulnerable to charges that emerge from the very past she tried to bury for survival? The trap is especially cruel because it forces NIKKI into a paradox. If she stays silent now, she looks guilty. If she speaks too much, she risks exposing herself further. If she tries to protect herself legally or publicly, Victor can interpret it as proof that she always prioritized herself, that her principles were just a costume. Meanwhile, Victor's fury becomes a kind of strategy. He can position his own downfall as a shared downfall, suggesting that NIKKI's hands were never clean and that the authorities should look closer. The threat isn't only that Victor might publicize NIKKI's secrets, it's that he might do it in a way that turns her into a bargaining chip. He could offer up NIKKI's past as leverage to bargain for his own advantage, not necessarily to get free, but to get power inside captivity, concessions, reduced charges. A narrative that makes him look less like a singular monster and more like a man caught in a web everyone helped spin. It becomes the oldest poison in their marriage, Victor insisting NIKKI is part of him whether she wants to be or not. NIKKI, on the other hand, faces the possibility that she might have to sacrifice herself to keep the truth intact, because if she retaliates with more evidence, she could drag the entire city down with them, exposing layers of complicity that stretch far beyond one marriage and one feud. The question of what if both NIKKI and Victor are arrested stops being a fan theory and starts becoming a logical endpoint of mutually assured destruction. If Victor exposes NIKKI, NIKKI may feel forced to reveal everything she knows for a buried connection, every secret exchange, every hidden chain just to prove she wasn't the mastermind and to show how deep Victor's manipulation truly ran. But that kind of full exposure doesn't end in closure. It ends in scorched earth, where even the people NIKKI wanted to protect herself included are reduced to collateral damage. It becomes a war not of love or business, but of survival, where each confession is a knife that cuts both the speaker and the target. And here is where the cruelest irony returns. NIKKI's original goal was to end guilt and stop the war so she wouldn't relapse, but being threatened with exposure, arrest, and public shame is exactly the kind of psychological torture that can push a recovering addict toward the old escape routes. NIKKI may never take a drink, but she can feel the abyss calling in quieter ways: sleeplessness, panic, the urge to disappear. The temptation to numb the body just to stop the mind from replaying the worst possibilities. If Victor wants revenge, he doesn't even need to put alcohol in her hand. He only needs to create a world where she feels trapped inside her own past again. That is Victor's most dangerous power. He can make people believe there is no version of the future where they are free. So the question becomes not just whether Victor will expose NIKKI's secrets, but whether NIKKI is prepared for the price of the truth she unleashed. Because in the aftermath of Victor's arrest, NIKKI realizes something horrifying. She did not simply take down a tyrant. She triggered a survival instinct in a man who has always treated love like ownership, and ownership like a license to destroy. Victor's arrogance was his weakness. Yes, but his cruelty, when cornered, has always been his strength. If he cannot control NIKKI with marriage, he can try to control her with fallout. If he cannot dominate Jabot with AI, he can dominate the narrative with scandal. He can aim at Nikki's reputation, her sobriety, her legitimacy as a woman trying to reclaim her life. And he can do it with the casual precision of a man who has always known where her scars are. Nikki begins to understand that the true confrontation has not happened yet. The arrest was only the opening blow. The real battle is the one that happens when Victor decides whether to burn Nikki down in public, whether to expose her past in a way that forces the authorities to widen their net and potentially take them both into custody. And if that happens, Genoa City won't be watching a villain finally punished. It will be watching the most powerful couple in town collapse into a spectacle of mutual confession, mutual betrayal, and mutual ruin. The kind that leaves no winner, only survivors. Nikki can feel the countdown in the air because Victor is not the kind of man who stays silent when he has a weapon. He is the kind of man who waits until the moment it will hurt the most. Which means Nikki's next decision may be the most dangerous one of her life. Whether to strike first again by revealing the secrets Victor holds over her before he can weaponize them, risking her own arrest to control the narrative, or whether to gamble that Victor still has a limit he won't cross, a limit he has rarely shown in the past when pride is bleeding. And as Nikki stares into that terrifying choice, her phone buzzes with a message that is short, cold, and unmistakably Victor. Even through intermediaries, he knows what she fears. And he's ready to trade her freedom for his revenge unless she comes to see him alone before morning.